my presentation was titled From Company to Company, the Past, Present, and Future Story of our Constitution. I will attempt to highlight, because I can't go into the details, the past constitutional developments in Kenya, the present, and then begin to project about future possibilities. I want us to look at that future, because my view is that you are the ones that will deal with that future. We have done our part in the past and the present, but I think you will do a lot of your part in the future. I will proceed like this. I will start by discussing a few conceptual points, very loose conceptual points. I'm still reflecting on them myself. So I will not call it a framework as such, but I'll say conceptual understanding of this subject. After I do that, I'll take us through the colonial constitutional development. Then I will look at the independence constitutional development, and there it's possible to break it into phases. We can talk about the Kenyatta one, that's where the bulk of it happened. We can talk about the Moi constitutional development. We can talk about the latter constitutional developments leading to the 2010 constitution, and then spend a bit of time there, and then after that begin to say, or begin to ask ourselves, where are we likely to go after this is done? What do we see in the near future? Having said that, now permit me to go back to the conceptual points, and I'll say that just as points and elaborate a bit where that is necessary. And I had put together around 7 conceptual points that I think are important in understanding our constitutional history. The first is that you can't ignore the Northerners or the Westerners in this discussion. They are part and parcel of our constitutional developments. And the Northerners, or Westerners, I don't know how you want to call them, appear to have known what they wanted to do here. They had an agenda. I've concluded the agenda was expansionist, largely. Okay? Their expansionist agenda began way before they even landed here, in my view. And we can start putting some dates on that, where we can talk authoritatively about. And if you will be shown the presentation, for me, it begins much more seriously around the 14th century, although there was a lot of history before then, and much more with the discovery of the printing press. Okay? They begin to share ideas. They can publish, including the Bible, and begin all manner of revolutions, some of which you know, that I don't need to go into details of. For example, the Reformation, people begin to reject traditional religion. The Catholic Church suffers at that point. We begin to have the Lutherans coming in, the Anglicans and so forth and so on, because they can now read the Bible and have their own understanding. We begin to have a renaissance. You've heard about the European Western Renaissance. They rediscover all the material that was lost. They're now capable of producing huge volumes and sharing those. And the ideas are flying left, right, and center there. Talk about the age of enlightenment, age of reason. All those are coming together. And with these serious ideas that I'm sure you've read from the first year, Montesquieu, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Voltaire, you know those big names that we've read about, dead white men, usually men white. The ideas are just beginning to come up at this point. And then Europe is on fire, so to speak. Okay. And incidentally, mankind hasn't discovered much until here. A lot of the revolutions you've seen in terms of invention begin to come when ideas are open, when people begin to debate ideas. That tells you how important it is to be here today and share ideas. We're just doing a quick search. For example, the steam engine is discovered in 1712. Mankind has lived forever on this earth. It's never known how to make an engine until around this time. What else we can talk about? Telephone, 1876. Okay. The automobile, I think Gari, a car, 1886. Aeroplane, around 1903, you've heard about the Wright brothers and all that. They're now discovering things Europe is on fire. But this imperialist agenda, if I was to go to point number 2, is therefore not restricted in Europe, because now they have to move out, seek raw materials, seek resources, and that's how we fall in that trap. Okay? And I'm sure you're all good students of history, at least in high school and primary school, and you've heard about the Berlin Conference, where European powers that have been in Africa found that they were wrestling over territory. And it wasn't good to wrestle over territory when there was a serious business to do in terms of capitalism, accumulation of wealth, okay? Acquiring more territories, acquiring more influence. So they retreated back to Berlin to discuss how they were going to partition Africa. And history tells you that there were 2 major resolutions made in the Berlin Conference. One, that European powers seeking to colonize Africa were going to declare their spheres of influence. Okay? That was to be followed by effective control. So you declare, this is my territory, that is yours, and then once you declare, you don't sleep on the job, you move in to take effective control of the territory and do your job thoroughly. Otherwise, you also lose the territory. And so we become victims of European, major European at that point, expansionist agenda. That would be my second conceptual point. The third one would be that this agenda was not just material, in terms of looking for physical goods and services. You know, they were also spiritual. And the best way to know this is to read Captain Frederick Lugard, who I am sure you've heard about at this stage. And Lugard wrote about the dual mandate. You're privileged in this era, you can search. He talked about the Europeans having 2 mandates in Africa. One was to use Africa's resources to develop Africa, but also to civilize Africans. Civilization is spiritual, isn't it? They have to change your religion, they have to change your viewpoint, they have to change your morality, they have to change your sense of justice, especially to know what is wrong or right, okay? And to just make you a modern person, from an ape to a human being. I think that was what was meant. So that was also part of imperialism. That would be my third conceptual point. The 4th conceptual point was that all this caught us by surprise. Okay? I am not forgetting that African prophets had actually prophesied the coming of the white man. If you're familiar with Akamba history, there was a prophet called Siokimau, for example, who prophesied that the railway would come, you know, all the way to Kabarak. If you're familiar with Kalenjin history, where we are, you are also aware that there was quite a letter out somewhere who talked about the black snake that comes spitting fire. I'm sure you heard about that. There were prophecies about the white man coming, but that notwithstanding, colonialism still found us unprepared, were caught by surprise. And our reaction, which is my 5th conceptual point, was at best reactionary. Our response was mostly reactionary. We tended to react to what has happened rather than plan ahead. So we're playing catch up, at best. At least conformist, if you asked me. That was another response we had. Conformist was to help what they're doing, just do what they're doing. And sometimes better. If you're living at this moment, you have seen the violence that we are meeting with each other, both from the police and the citizenry. It's a violence that must have been learned somewhere. We are doing quite well in that job. The reactionary kind of response were, for example, the first resistance to colonial occupation. You remember? People fought. There were battles for resisting colonial occupation. There were also battles to repossess our land that had been taken away. Okay? Battles to return to our culture, to our values. You've heard about Diniam Sample and the like. You've heard about independence churches. All that was just to react at what had happened to us. But conformist is clear to you. I think you can see it. Greed, capitalism, selfish accumulation. All those are aping, what the white person had done. But at worst, part of our reaction was also destructive, falling into their traps, division, inter-country, interstate violence, interstate divisions, and all that kind of thing, but also just corruption, looting, and the kind of things that Alex was kind enough to discuss with us earlier today. So that's what we do, and it's part of our conceptual understanding of African reaction to colonial occupation. Sadly, and if you read the likes of Mamdani, you will see this. Sadly, we have been embroiled in the problem. Okay? We are deep in the mess that we can't think. There's something called hindsight that is a blessing. Okay? I was always told that when you're in a crisis, take some time off, reflect. I wish Ruto and Raila did that. Yeah, that's why ceasefire is important. Reflect and then return tomorrow. You might be better off with some hindsight. We've never had hindsight. That's what I'm saying as part of my conceptual point for this discussion. We are always in the heat of reaction, in the heat of the conflict, in the heat of the challenge, never having a chance to think properly and come up with a solution. And as Mamdani has said, therefore, what we have is a crisis of perspective, paralysis of perspective. We have no solution, or we appear to have none out of this problem. And finally, my last conceptual point is that as we struggle with the old problems, as the old problems persist, new challenges have arisen. The guys have shifted the goalposts. The game has changed. The rules have changed. And before we know that, before we discuss the new game, we are still battling about the old game. That is really where we are conceptually. I hope those points make sense. And if they haven't made sense up to now, they're going to make sense in the next few minutes when I now deal with the real institutional developments that happened to our people. I must begin by saying that I've seen this argument, especially forcefully made in Professor Gideon Mugai's book, which I was privileged to be one of the editors. It's published at Kabarak University Press. The book is called Power, Politics, and Law. He entertains a very interesting discussion there, for example, about whether there was even constitutional development in the colonial era in the first place. That is a discussion we should have another day when we have time, because I'm willing to spend time on it. And one could ask this question: was it constitutional development or was it constitutional administration? Was it colonial administration? Why that question is important is because it goes at the core of the meaning of constitutional law. Okay? Is it possible that a colony, in fact, initially, a protectorate, can have constitutional law? Is it possible that a territory run by bylaws, in fact, not even bylaws, schedules most of the time, orders in council most of the time, letters of patent, oral instructions, those are the kind of tools, warrants, those are the kind of legal tools that led our country during the colonial network. Is it possible that they could have constitutional law? Is it possible that a territory that is not a state, that is not independent, that is being governed sort of as a trustee, is it possible that it could have its own constitutional law? Is that a discussion you want to have? And if it is true that that is possible, then what is the meaning of constitutional law? I just entered that as a rider so that you know that I'm aware of the conversations that were there, and that I will therefore use the word constitutional law a bit loosely here and accept that we had constitutional development only to the limited extent that some of the things that happened in the constitutional epoch are the foundation and basis of what we now call constitutional law of Kenya. Okay? So if you agree with me to that extent, then you will give me the latitude to use the word constitutional development, especially after 1920 when it was simply a protectorate, but also 1963 when we were a colony for most of Kenya, especially outside the coast of Cape. So that then takes me to discuss with you how this constitutional law, how this colonial seed was sold in Kenya. And that gives you the first part of the title of my presentation, which is the company. Because when people saw that title, I think the presentation was online and then people saw it, they kept asking me whether I'm talking about the company that has been talked about by the Deputy President, Mr. Gachagua. He kept saying that the Deputy President has said that Kenya is a company with shareholders, and you must know where you belong. If you don't have shares in Kenya, shut up. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the fact that proper colonial administration in Kenya began with a company. Okay. There was initially what we call British East Africa Association, BEAA, that was soon converted to the Imperial British East Africa. Initially a company of the Sultanate regime, but eventually made a royal chartered company to govern on behalf of the Queen. You can imagine, let me use the word crown, to govern on behalf of the crown. You can imagine that we had a unique situation where the company was, company corporate, but also company politic. Usually we talk about corporate. Companies are body corporates. But in this unique situation, the company was also body political. Because it ran government. Part of its mandate was to establish courts, is to administer this territory now, that time called East African Protectorate, collect some taxes, sign some treaties on behalf of the crown, and those kind of duties are not typical company duties. So we can say that this was also a body politic as much as it was a body corporate. So we begin administration in Kenya by a company, okay, physical company, looking for money, looking for territory, looking for labor, looking for taxes, and such like things. And that is where we began. I think formally around 1887, when the company starts duty, but much more formally around 1895, when the protectorate status is declared for Kenya. So that would be for me among the earlier constitutional development in Kenya, if you want to be strict that that would be a constitutional development. We move on to declare protectorate 1895, and we also move on to declare a colony around 1920. Key constitutional developments, if you asked me. So they have established colonial rule by that time, and they have begun to settle in one by one. It is beyond, like I said, the scope of this discussion today to tell you which ordinance came in, and you know them, the 1897 ordinance, I think is the second one, and one of the major ones that is put in place, the machinery for administration of this regime. You know more than me that it was always courts, administration, politics coming later for most colonies in Africa. You can check your history. It's strange that actually courts will be put first. Strange that administration will be put first, and then politics fought for and coming in later. That appears to be the development. Another development you will see when you study earlier constitutional developments in Kenya is that there appears to have been this privileged group called the white settlers, who thought that this was their territory. And initially, the fights were among them. Remember, there are white settlers have come to farm, been promised several things. They're going to be lords with thousands of acres of land that are fertile, with rights to kill animals as they wish. There are such games, by the way. And then there were officials who had been sent here by the colonial administration to run government. And the settlers began to agitate for space within that government, to agitate for representation. And the claim that you can't tax us without representation began to emerge. And many times they were told, we're not yet taxing you. You're not yet a colony. In fact, we're taxing those black people more than yourselves. Shut up. And so that agitation was there, I can say, for the first 20 years of the 1900s, until colony status was made. So there was back and pull among the Europeans themselves about what will happen to them. Are we going to be represented? Are we going to say something? Are we going to be included in government? Or are we going to keep outside the government? Permit me again to summarize by saying that the development at this point was initially the white settlers fighting for space in the white government. Understandably so, because you've been brought all the way to settle here. The government of the day does not have any semblance of representation as you are used to in your country. The common law has not been brought here, and therefore you feel as if your rights are being violated. And a lot of the drama at that point was on that. But secondly also, some assurances that we were going to settle here, like they had settled elsewhere. They are settled in territories outside Africa, you know that, Australia, for example, if we're talking about British colony especially. They are settled in America, you know that. In Africa, there were settlements in South Africa. There were settlements in Zimbabwe. And what about Kenya? We can do what we did elsewhere here. And I think a lot of white people at that point had the idea of settling here permanently and making this a white settler country. Those goals were frustrated because the colonial government was not ready for that. I'm sure you've read about late colonialism. They were aware of the dangers of that. And back at home, that time run by the Foreign Office, was not comfortable with making Kenya another settled territory. And so in the paper that has since been called the Devonshire White Paper, which I'm sure you have read about, which was meant to address especially Indian concerns, the Crown was able to make proper directions that Kenya was not going to be settled, that this is an African territory, and that it's going to be left to the natives at the right time. In the meantime, this country is being run on behalf of the natives as a trust. I hope you know that, by the way. There was a time we were not capable of running our country, and someone else was running our country as trustees for us. By the way, I'm jumping gun here, but missionaries will be asked to represent the African interests. Because missionaries were good people, they knew the Africans, they could speak for the Africans. So the Africans could not sit in the institutions of governance, initially the Executive Council, later the Legislative Council as well. The Africans were out of place, but their interests would be represented by the missionaries. So this was a trust, in other words, and the Devonshire White Paper made that clearly in 1923. So remember that constitutional development, because it will be one of the turning points of this discussion. The Asians as well begin to fight for representation. Remember, we have two kinds of Asians, the Indians, most of whom had come to make a railway, isn't it? And then we also have the Arabs, most of whom had come through the normal trade and exploration networks that had been there earlier. And both of them now began to demand for space in the new administration. And so a lot of constitutional developments that you will see will be that kind of thing. The white men first, the Asians coming in, compromises here and there, and we'll talk about the Executive Council, the Legislative Council, and that is really, for me, the predominance of that discussion. The Asians also wanted some rights to own land. We are familiar with that discussion. And I think that debate was tough, went back and forth. And I think eventually some form of apartheid was agreed upon. The Asians have their spaces. The white men, predominantly white men, have their spaces in the White Highlands, and the Africans have their spaces in the native areas where they could live and enjoy their backwardness in ports. Until now, I'm sure you notice, the Asians still live where they were told to live. In Nairobi around Parklands, the Africans in Eastlands, and the privileged in western parts of Nairobi. Still there, the apartheid is still there, and the Arabs will remain in Mombasa and the coastal towns. That kind of apartheid was constitutional if you agree to the definition that I have given. Proper African revolts, I would say formal African revolt, formal. Because I've already said that the Africans had revolted early, in their own ways. Because when the conquest began, the Africans reacted. Some violently, some signed pacts or treaties, and some of them, of course, were lies, treachery, conmanship, and stuff like that. But eventually, there was some calm in some areas, and colonial government administration took place. But the proper reaction that I'm talking about here is where the Africans begin to engage the constitutional systems that have been set. We see a lot of this towards the 30s. Some interesting developments happened around the 40s, where, for example, we have the first African to enter the Legislative Council. I think you read that in your primary schools, Edwin Martin. And from this time on, Africans can now enter the institutions of government without being represented by the missionary. We begin to see nationwide political movement in terms of political parties. And one of the most obvious political parties is the Kenya African Union, which now could mobilize nationally. Before that, African political activity was supposed to be restricted to the native areas. No community could exchange political ideas with the other. In fact, movement between what you now call counties predominantly, with the exception of a few counties, the other counties remain as they were in the colonial epoch as districts. You couldn't move without a pass to the other. And so the African political activity was not national at all. It should explain, by the way, why it is still difficult for us to mobilize our political activity beyond our ethnic groups. Because the districts were not just geographical areas, but principally also ethnic areas. So for the first time in the 40s, you are now seeing permission for the Africans to mobilize beyond the areas that they were restricted to, and you see Kenya African Union coming up. And something else also happens. Many Africans begin to return from the Second World War. If you are my age, you know that there were always villagers that claimed to have gone to Burma and returned with a radio, isn't it? A guitar or something like that. And began to do something interesting with that. They were woke. Some Africans now knew things that others didn't. Even the earliest music in this region, food recordings in this world, not just Kenya, Congo, would be around 1946, 47, the earliest proper music that is recorded in the modern sense would be post-World War. But politically also, there was a lot of agitation, a lot of political pressure after the World War that can only be explained by the enlightenment that these guys had gotten when they went to fight India, Asia, and so the kind of things that were happening there. And so we had a lot of political activity after the World War, leading us to the emergency. And the emergency led us again to a lot of constitutional developments that we can talk about later, including a lot of regulations to contain the exhalation, including excessive use of force by the state agencies. Sounds familiar, I'm sure, at the moment, because I'll be talking about that again later, and then also including African consensus on how to react to colonial power. So a lot of that happens, and you see a lot of pressure around that time going forward. And for good students of constitutional law will remember the Littleton Constitution, will remember the Lennox-Boyd Constitution, and I want to suggest that all these were just about inclusion. All these efforts were mostly reactionary. A lot of prominence now on the African side, as opposed to the first few years up to 1940. Now the Africans are stronger, they're bigger, and they're being hurt. And it's quite clear in the 40s, 50s that these guys are unstoppable. I'd like to speak about the 1957 legend, where prominent Africans have now come to present their regions. Okay. Just to emphasize that even before the Africans could get the right to represent themselves, a lot of roadblocks have been put on the right to franchise. I hope you'll remember this, that you had to show that you have property to be able to vote or to be voted for. I hope you know that. That there was a criteria to determine whether you can vie for political office. That criteria tended to be a class issue. Education was a criteria, ownership of property was a criteria, and many Africans could not vote even when that was allowed. Out of millions of Africans, slightly more than 300,000 could vote in the early elections that were declared. So please remember those details, because they will come back when I'm talking about the African reaction. So we end up in a situation where we must negotiate a new constitutional order for Kenya, and we must also negotiate independence for Kenya. That is the basis of what has been called the Lancaster Constitutional Conferences. It wasn't one conference, it was more than one, and the Africans deliberated on their future future constitution, they deliberated on their independence and how their independence is going to look. If I was to summarize again, I would tell you that the main thing here in this epoch was that the white persons began to realize that they were going to be minorities in the new regime. I think independence was quite clear and obvious at this point, and began to team up with other Africans that considered themselves minorities. Minority Africans at that point were, for example, the Kalenjin, were not as many as they are today, you'll be surprised. The Luya nation were not as many as they are today, and they were not as influential politically either. The coastal people, I think they remained where they were. So that explains why Ronald Gala, Masinde Muliro, and Daniel Moi came together in what is called Kenya African Democratic Union, KADU, to begin to speak for the minority groups among the Africans. And the white people took advantage of that and worked together with them against the big tribes. The big tribes were Kikuyu and Luos at independence. They were not just big in size, they were also big in the sense that colonial activity had been a bit more entrenched in their regions. For example, through the church, through missionary schools, and a lot of Luos and Kikuyus had gone to school. They were the pioneer educators, they were the pioneer leaders of this country, and the smaller tribes had feared that they'll be dominated by the big tribes once independence comes. So the game shifts. The white man becomes a minority all of a sudden. Okay? He had always been a minority in number, but majority in control. But now the fear was that they were the majority twice in number and in political influence or significance. So they team up and win the kind of negotiations that they had in Lancaster. When you read your history properly, you will find that they actually consulted prominent constitutional lawyers from countries such as the United States and outmaneuvered Kenyatta's term in the Lancaster constitutional deliberations. Among the things that KADU was able to secure in the Lancaster deliberations was, for example, devolution of power, what we call majimbo that time. I would think that was regionalism, or think it was federalism, but majimbo is our local word, and I would prefer to use it. Okay? The KADU did not want that. The other thing they were able to secure is serious checks and balances on the independent government. Knowing very well that they were going to be in power, KADU did not want that kind of constitution where presidential power was subjected to extreme checks and balances. They were opposed to that. They were able to secure a very progressive Bill of Rights by the standards of that time, okay? Which the people that were coming to power were not happy with. They were able to secure things such as bicameralism, 2 houses, House of Representatives and the Senate. Serious separation of powers. And by the way, it's checks and balances. And even more seriously, a very rigid constitutional framework. It was going to be impossible to change, ordinarily speaking. Okay? Those are some of the things that the KADU guys, working together with the white minorities, were able to secure in Lancaster. And this is how we ended up conducting the independence elections and KADU winning those elections and President Kenyatta being invited to lead. I'm sure you will know that Kenyatta did not lead immediately because he was in prison. And there were these calls that we shouldn't form government until Kenyatta comes. I think that's part of common history. And I believe that Ronald Gala must have ran government on behalf of the Africans until Kenyatta was released from detention and then took over the reins of power as president. Not president, initially Prime Minister of the Republic of Kenya. The constitution decided at that point was that there would be Prime Minister and the Queen would continue to govern us. I believe the way New Zealand, or maybe I think even Australia as well, they still operate under the leadership of the Queen. And so we did that between 63 and 64, having that kind of system until Kenyatta abolished it. So that's how we began our independence phase, in other words. I was going through that very fast because that was not really the crux of my presentation, because that was the past. That is how they established colonial rule and how we began to react. But I think our proper reaction, our real reaction would be what we did in the independence epoch. That's what I want to focus on just for a few minutes now. If you want to understand the science of what happened in the independence era, it's not rocket science, it's that obvious. That what appears to have happened in the independence era constitutional development was very simple. Number one, okay, it was very simple actually, to weaponize the constitution to, number one, consolidate power, to strengthen the presidency, weaken the institution of checks and balances, settle political scores, and obstruct human rights. Simple. That is what we did constitutionally in the Kenyatta era, in the Moi era. And Moi era, we can talk about phase 1 and phase 2, shall be coming to that. So Kenyatta 1, and then Moi phase 1, that's what you will see happening. The idea here was, and I think I've already hinted, the constitution of Lancaster had not been accepted by the leaders of Kanu. In fact, books have recorded that while we discussed the Lancaster Constitution, some influential forces in Kanu had responded that let them do what they want. As soon as we get our independence, we shall correct those things one by one. Kenyatta is on record as having said that, and influential figures in Kanu are on record as having said that. And if they outmaneuver us in Lancaster, we shall outmaneuver them after we get power. And true to the word, that's exactly what they did. So I want you to understand constitutional development in the colonial era, therefore, in the post-colonial era, to be exactly about weaponizing the constitution to get what they wanted to be done in those areas that I've highlighted. Do you want me to pick some examples to just demonstrate what I've said? So for example, to consolidate power, the First Amendment, 1964, was about fusing the powers of the Prime Minister and the Crown and making the President one person, and Kenyatta himself, and making him the first President of the Republic of Kenya, eliminating the checks that had been presented in the separation of the office between the Queen and the Prime Minister. That amendment, by the way, assured President Kenyatta that he was going to be president without an election. I hope you know that as well. There was no election of president. Kenyatta moved from Prime Minister to presidency and combined both powers and sent away the Queen, all in one, 1964 amendments. That was aimed at consolidating power. There were others, for example, weakening the regional governments. We had strong regional governments, and the executive head of the regional governments were called the president. Kenyatta did away with that, by the way, because there was only supposed to be one president, and that was the president of the Republic of Kenya. Nowadays, I see that student leaders also call themselves presidents. I hope you do that as well. Congratulations, you're being ordained today, I hear. That title was earned. There were times when you couldn't say president except when you were referring to the president of the Republic, because Kenyatta banned that. Let me give you other examples. Weakening of checks and balances, for example. There were two houses, House of Representatives and Senate. They were fused. Those two houses were composed to comprise what we call the National Assembly. The two houses were fused together so that the checks and balances that usually are between the two houses were removed altogether. And the new definition of the National Assembly would now be, a new definition of Parliament would now be National Assembly plus the President. No two houses. And again, we were able to fuse the houses, add 40 constituencies, guarantee the members of Parliament of a longer term so that they could not complain when the amendments were being done. All that again done at the initial years of the Kenyatta regime. There were more interesting amendments that were aimed at settling political scores. Very interesting ones. One of the most interesting, of course, I don't know whether this is settling a political score only, but also helping our friend. The one in 1975, where Kenyatta helps Paul Gay to come back to politics. Those days, if you are found guilty of an electoral offense, the offense could not be given pardon even by the president. So an amendment was made to say you can forgive, you can pardon, and the amendment was done with Paul Gay in mind, so that it could help Kenyatta deal with certain things, including the opposition that he was facing at that point, politically. Other subtle ones, like 1974, I find that very interesting. An amendment was done to say that Kiswahili would be the only language in Parliament. 1974. I hope you understand what I mean. There were some people in Parliament who were not good at Kiswahili. They were very good in English. And they caused a lot of chaos in Parliament. How do you deal with that? So you shut them out by introducing a language they do not understand and claiming to be Africanizing, making Parliament accessible to the people. So somebody is settling political scores using the Constitution and not saying so. Of course, the others were purely to weaken our rights. For example, President Kenyatta was able to enact amendments in Parliament whereby he could reduce the safeguards placed on the power of emergencies. You know, the usual safeguards. For example, typically when you are regulating emergencies, you reduce the time. Okay? You reduce the time in which an emergency can last without parliamentary approval. You also many times subject it to judicial control, in addition to significant majorities in Parliament, and so forth and so on. There was a first amendment relaxing a bit of those emergency safeguards, and then another amendment again, extending the emergency safeguards, eventually allowing the president to run emergencies over a long period without parliamentary or even judicial control. Of course, initially the excuse was, and this is understandable partly, I'm sure you're familiar that as soon as we got our independence, there was a big problem in the northern frontier districts, especially the Somali community, asking to secede. And the shift of war that resulted was quite complex for the president, and a lot of human rights violations to happen quite early on in Kenyatta's administration. We seem to have that curse of early trouble for presidents. For Kenyatta, it was the Shifta War. For President Moi, it was Jaramogi Oginga Odinga planning political activity earlier on, within 1 year of his swearing in, and soon Kenya, and then very soon Aku 1982. I'm sure you've heard about this. When you're just 2 years old in power, there's a coup organized against you, you become frightened, you react, and the reaction would determine the entire fate of the republic over a long period of time. Ruto is facing the same fate, as you know, isn't it? 6 months into power and a very serious installation. It's hard to be done on him, and I don't know how he reacts. But whichever way he reacts, my view is that it will affect his presidency in a very significant way. It happened to Kibaki as well, I'm sure you know that. That the first term of Kibaki was quite dramatic, ending us in what we've never seen before, post-election violence of 2007. And the rest of the story, as you know, is history. So we seem to have that curse of early installations against our presidents, which sometimes have serious repercussions in the kind of regimes or legacies that they leave behind. So Kenyatta had that, and his reaction wasn't really good. I think it also affected his human rights record. I was just giving you examples of how Kenyatta reacted or how he operated the Constitution and how he reacted to constitutional development. And remember, I've already said that a lot of it was to react to Lancaster. A lot of it was to entrench himself, to consolidate power. But a lot of it was also just to ape what the colonies had done. They were authoritarian, they also became authoritarian. They used a lot of police, they also used police. That's what you know. That's how you are mentored. That's how you are schooled. Many times you become what your teachers were, by the way, without knowing. And so Kenyatta appeared to also emulate what he had learned from his masters and sometimes excelling beyond them. So comes Moi, and again, his tenure is not without some trouble. And Moi also does a lot of constitutional amendments, but not as much as Kenyatta. In fact, I think that Moi fared quite well, if you ask me, compared to Kenyatta, but also compared to his contemporaries in Africa. Whether you're thinking of Mobutu Sese Seko, whether you're thinking of even Nyerere, I think in terms of authoritarianism, I think Moi had a chance to live two lives, in my view. Phase one, do a bit of what Kenyatta did, and phase two, live to see, live to redo what had been done earlier. And I'll give you an illustration. Of course, the first amendment that Moi did was to return English to Parliament. So the language of Parliament was English, and that's the first amendment he did. The second one is dangerous. It was to make an amendment to the Constitution to say that Kenya is now a de jure single-party state. Initially, single-partyhood had been assumed, especially after the battles between Jaramogi Oginga Odinga and Moi were settled. We did have a second political party, not because the law said so, but simply because political activity had been threatened out. Opposition to Kenyatta had been silenced by force, and not necessarily by law. And Moi went on to make sure that the law says exactly that. I suspect that Moi did this, actually it's written already, it's written by historians. Moi did this to deal with Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, who was already organizing to resuscitate some political parties. Jaramogi is Raila's father. So Moi rushed ahead of him and used the constitution to settle that political score. Remember, I've already mentioned that the constitution was being used to fight constitutional battles. That is one example of those illustrations. Something else that Moi did that wasn't quite funny was to remove security of tenure for some offices. I don't care about the office of the Attorney General. I always think that the Attorney General should be loyal to the President. But I care about the Office of Controller and Auditor General. The security of tenure was removed. Then also the security of tenure of judges was removed. And there was a lot of talk that time that you should be loyal to the President. Your security if you're loyal to the President. There are a lot of political statements to that effect, which I don't think are very good for constitutional development. However, in Moi phase 2, you begin to see that Moi has a chance to correct his mistakes. It's rare that you have this kind of chance, even in life, isn't it? Many people die with their mistakes, but Moi's regime had that advantage that he could correct some of the mistakes he made, not necessarily because of his own initiation, but much more because of the environment and the paradigms of the time, including the struggles from outside, especially the movement for multi-party reforms, movement for human rights, movement for good governance, but also movement for a new constitutional order. So you see that in 1991, thereabout, we were able to change the constitution, and Kenya again became a multi-party state by law. That is Moi himself doing what he's done. Security of tenure judges was returned, and Moi is able to oversee a significant movement around 1997 that allowed us to negotiate a few consensus issues ahead of major constitutional reforms in the future. What you see today, for example, in the Mandamano debate, was negotiated in IPPG reforms. I think I'm talking about Section 5 of the Public Order Act. Initially, getting to do a rally wasn't that obvious or automatic. Getting to demonstrate wasn't that obvious or automatic. But after the 1997 reforms, which you call the Inter-Party Parliamentary Group reforms, a consensus was arrived at whereby all you needed to do is notify the police that you're going to have a meeting, and the police was supposed to bring to come and secure the meeting. So you see in 1997 that political activity began to be prudent. That section has become useful, although I think we must think it again after this Mandamano that is ongoing. The section appears inadequate to solve our problems, but it worked for them. It liberated the media, it opened up political activities. It also said that the electoral management body, that time we called it the ECK, the Electoral Commission of Kenya, had to be comprised by representatives of the different political parties. so that no one person appoints the commissioners. Initially, it was the president that would appoint the IBC of them, the ECK, and it was a case where the player appoints both the referee and plays the game at the same time. Okay, but there were some reforms around 1997 that were quite useful in taking our democratic practice forward. So Moi oversees that, but much more else. President Moi was also there when we enacted the first Constitution of Kenya Review Act that paved the way for the reform of our constitution. And in fact, at that point, he had had his handshake with Jaramogi's son, that is Raila Odinga. And I don't know how old most of you are. At that time, we were talking about Jogo swallowing the tractor. Raila had a party whose symbol was a tractor, and the President Moi's party was a Jogo. And so there were all manner of cartoons about a Jogo swallowing the tractor, and debates about whether the tractor will survive or the Jogo will survive, and all that. But they worked a bit quite well. Eventually starting the constitutional review process together, inviting a very prominent constitutional scholar in Kenya, Professor Yash Pamgai, to come and chair that Constitution of Kenya Review Commission. One of the panelists today, Dr. Mutaka Kanu, who is a great friend of mine, was also a member of that commission. It's that commission that went around the country collecting views and enacted the first draft Constitution of Kenya, taking it to the Bomas, Bomas, I don't know whether you know the place. There's a place called Bomas, but I'm talking about here as a Bomas Constitutional Conference and discussing the Constitution. Of course, something happened in between. We had elections, because 2002 was first coming, and we elected President Kibaki. And when President Kibaki resumed power, he was not interested in that process, and he appeared to frustrate any efforts to take that process forward. We tried to resuscitate the process again. Many of you remember the Wako draft, but there were many drafts in between. I'm summarizing so that I can move to end this conversation and start maybe a question and answer session or comment session. There was a committee of experts again, but maybe before I go there, just need to say that we had a Wako draft constitution, what we call the proposed new constitution of Kenya, that we took to a referendum. If you're old enough, you know about orange and banana. Did you guys see that? Yes, I was involved in civic education at that point. We went around the country informing the public on constitutional issues so that they could take part in an informed manner, and then eventually the constitution was rejected at the referendum. Actually, it resounded. That is the foundation of the Orange Democratic Movement. For those who may not know, because the win by ODM Orange was quite a big win, and Honorable Raila Odinga said that from today on, that Orange will become a political party. Things did go well. This is 2005. Things did go well, if you're familiar with our history. The Orange movement became quite emboldened and began to threaten the government of President Kibaki in the first term. Kibaki had just come in 2003 on a wheelchair, late 2002, on a wheelchair, a bit unstable, and soon thereafter there was a conflict in his coalition, and soon thereafter we had to do this referendum that went very bad politically for him. And Raila was quite strong at that point, marshalling the whole country, creating a serious movement that included even the current president, William Ruto, and eventually we had to go to violence. The violence was coming, by the way. For those who have careful eyes, you could see it. It was not far away. And we had a terrible, terrible time in 2007. I had the misfortune, I don't know whether you want to call it, of working in human rights organization at that point, and going around the country at the point of the post-election violence in 2007. And I can tell you that it was not funny. We were in Naivasha, Kisumu, and I remember going to Kisumu and finding a woman whose husband had been killed in Naivasha. all she was able to rescue was the head of the husband in a paper bag. And that was a very sad moment for some of us in human rights. Very traumatized, even from the stories we had, so the things we experienced. It's very sad that we are still playing with violence at this moment. We have forgotten too fast. But it's part of the framework that I've just explained. I will be coming back to that. So after the 2007 violence, some negotiations were done, especially championed by the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, and an agreement reached that Kenya must now do comprehensive constitutional reforms and other things, for example, police reforms, socio-economic conditions getting changed and stuff like that. But I'm keen here on constitutional reforms. And so we embarked again on a new process. A committee of experts was appointed, and that's how we ended up with that draft constitution that led us to the 2010 constitution. I don't think I need to tell you about the referendum of 2010. You are a bit older, most of you. At that time, we were talking about green and red. Did you see that? It wasn't orange and bananas this time. And sometimes I think that the IBC can determine the election beforehand. Between a banana and an orange, which one would you pick? It's quite obvious. Bananas are always crooked. No one wants bananas when an orange is there, I think. People like green as opposed to red. Red is always, I think so. So once they say this was green, then I think it was clear where the direction was headed. And that's also the genesis of watermelon. I'm sure you've heard watermelons. It began there because some politicians like Kalonzo Musyoka were not quite clear where they fell. As people said, you see, watermelon has both colors. It's red inside, it's green outside, so that kind of thing. So, yeah, but we had a referendum, and again, the constitution was in a big way. And something that I ought to mention in passing is that eventually a new regime came to power on that basis in 2013. The regime happened to be the same people that were not very keen on that constitution. The current president is usually very clear on what he stands for, and is among the few politicians in 2010 who spoke clearly about his position on the constitution. Okay? And he said that he did support it. Together with President Uhuru Kenyatta, they won power in 2013, and so it was upon people that didn't necessarily support the constitution to now implement it. I don't know if I'm making sense. Sounds familiar? 63? 2013. The constitution was taken over again by people who didn't support it. But incidentally, they actually don't do any major changes to it. With the exception of attempts, for example, aimed at, for example, provided for the 2,000 gender rule, you don't see President Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto attempting major insults or assaults on the constitution. You see this much later in the second term of President Kenyatta, when working together with the Right Honorable Odinga, we start the BBI, they call Bridging Bridges Initiative, ideally to transform that constitution into something else. I'll be talking about that shortly. But then, in other words, I'm saying that you don't see any major change happening or succeeding in the Kenyatta era, Kenyatta 2 era. And I think partly because the constitution itself had serious safeguards this time, partly because the public was vigilant to ensure that this doesn't happen, especially civil society. The courts are also a bit vigilant at this point. So the constitution survives 13 years now and going strong. No major attack has succeeded. What exactly is this 2010 constitution? I will tell you how I see it, and then we can go to future possibilities and we'll open up for discussion. If you asked me in summary to tell you about the 2010 constitution, I will tell you that it's a transformative document. I will tell you that it's a document that understands our past. Police brutality, which you are seeing right now, excess use of power, strong presidency, a weak Bill of Rights, or that had been made weak by either constitutional amendments or judicial pronouncements. A lot of corruption, lack of integrity institutions, lack of additional oversights over and above the political ones. So for example, we didn't have the National Human Rights Commission, we didn't have an Ethics and Integrity Commission, and the Constitution has done a little bit of that, strengthening the oversights. So the whole idea is to move Kenya to a new order altogether, where human rights are possible, democratic governance is possible, socio-economic equality and development is possible, and so correct the past mistakes that have begun not just in the Kenyatta era, but also even before independence. That's how I see the movement in the 2010 Constitution. And I will leave it there because that's a constitution you experience, you are learning, and you know a bit more detail about. So what is the future of our constitutional development? My sense is that if you wanted to know the future of constitutional development in Kenya, you have got to read the BBI document, the Building Bridges Initiative, discussions, deliberations of the various bills that came out of it, and most importantly, the last bill that we challenged in the constitutional courts, from the High Court all the way to the Supreme Court. You'll begin to have a sense of the worries and concerns of the political class, and I believe those could give you a hint on where we are headed. And then you also have got to read the memorandum that President William Ruto issued to the Speakers of Parliament earlier this year, asking them to consider, I think, 4 areas of reform. If you read those two together, you then get an idea of where the political order is headed in terms of constitutional reforms. There are small things there, there are big things there. I could mention some things that look small, but maybe have been ignored. For example, the office of the Deputy Governor. That office hasn't been properly entrenched. Something has been done on the legislative side, but I think that discussion might keep coming up. The place of Senate in the bicameral Parliament, we have tried to deal with that through court orders, through the practice of the bicameral Parliament itself, but I suspect that that discussion will keep coming up. Those are the small issues, but I think the major 3 issues will be the ones I've highlighted there. The first one being the 4th generation rights. The 4th generation rights for me would be the gender rights. I mean women's rights, for example. Women have triumphed in many areas, if you asked me, but I suspect that that battle still has a few flaws to be completed. For example, I foresee that this 2/3 rule business will have to be fought properly in William Ruto's tenure this first term. We have to resolve that issue. Many of you will recall that just before the elections, a petition had been made to the Chief Justice of the time, Justice David Maraga, to declare Parliament unconstitutional because it had not met the 2/3 gender rule, and he actually did so. Of course, we had a number of litigations in court, eventually headed to elections without resolving the issue, but the issue of matter is still alive, especially if you look at the President's memorandum. The other 4th generation issue in the area of gender would be the issue of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, you know the issue, intersex, queer, you know the debate, LGBTQ. That debate will have to be resolved constitutionally from where I sit. The Supreme Court has led the way already from where I sit, and I suspect that there's going to be a rebuttal on the political front. My suspicion is that parliamentarians will do something about this. And no matter the direction this goes, it could head the constitutional law way. That's a conversation we must have. Looking at Uganda, you will notice that as soon as our Supreme Court spoke, they rushed very quickly to revive earlier parliamentary initiatives and reenacted their law that is harsher than any other capital offenses that you are aware of. You know about the developments there. My suspicion that had it not been for Mandaman, we would have already climbed to that level in our own parliament. I think the Mandaman has diverted attention from those kind of things, to these kind of power issues. But that issue might come back. The other issue I see being major in the near future, and even a longer future, is the issue of power sharing. From where I sat when we were writing the 2010 Constitution, I had imagined that we had settled that point. I actually thought that devolution was going to disperse some influential political leaders and that there will be less attention at the national level. But I think I was a bit wrong in my earlier estimation. I suspect that we still need to resolve that issue because major political actors are likely to ask for some space in the leadership of the nation, and that space is quite small. It's actually finite. You only have the president and deputy president, and beyond that, there's not much to share to an influential political figure. My suspicion then is that we might need to reconsider our position, whether we are a presidential system, parliamentary system, or hybrid altogether. That discussion is going to come. The fourth issue, and I'm writing it politically correctly, I'm writing it diplomatically. If you read what I've written there, I'm talking about funding and mitigating politics. My suspicion is, again, that this issue is going to be resolved, must be resolved in one way or another. I was in civil society for a long time myself as well, and I've had a chance to work with many politicians in the last 10 years or so. And one thing that has come to my mind is that as civil society actors, we are always removed from the politics of the day, and we don't understand how politicians think. So for instance, political financing of a presidential election is very expensive. Okay. My estimation right now is that you need about 20 to 30 billion to run a successful presidential election campaign. Yeah, Kenya shillings. You will earn, once elected, how much? 2 million per month. In a year, 24 million. In 5 years, how many? Around 20 million. Some lawyers know math.
That's 12 and 5. 24 and 5.
Yes.
120.
120. Yes. How would you spend 20 billion to earn 20 million? To earn 120 billion? How would you spend 20 billion to earn 120 billion? That is not good math. Yeah? So we must begin debating how to fund political finance, political campaigns. And it can't be individuals using their resources to do that. We must find a constitutional basis for discussing this. Something else, to meet this cost, presidential candidates usually have to get help from friends. You will have probably 70, 80, 90 people giving you millions of shillings, taking care of your campaign, taking care of that rally, and some of them might lose their own political contests. Where do you accommodate them? The reforms that we had earlier, which were pioneered by the civil society and ordinary Kenyans, had limited the amount of spaces available for the president to make appointments. So the president of Kenya can appoint, in my view, less than 30, 40 people. We have around 23 cabinet secretaries to appoint, 22. You have around, CS is not even a constitutional office. So that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. So it means that the president has to devise ways of survival, including creating the office of CS. Some of your friends who fell out get into power. Because how then do you run your political campaigns? How do you ensure that they'll still be loyal in the next political phase? We need to start discussing those things. And my suggestion is that whether we like it or not, politicians themselves will initiate initiatives that look innocent, but the whole idea will be to mitigate the extremes of politics. So I'm thinking about the CS's position, for example. I'm thinking about CDF. Politicians need some money to appear to be doing something. We have told them severally that CDF is unconstitutional, but I suspect that that argument will not stand. Politicians will find a way of ensuring that there's a fund for a senator, a fund for a member of National Assembly, a fund for a county assembly, member, and so forth and so on, so that they can be liquid as they do their activities. Otherwise, you're asking them to use their own resources. And if you become tougher at the integrity center, the what do you call it, the anti-corruption entity, the more you become tougher there by appointing a very good bishop, my own bishop again at ESCC, the more you must begin paving way on other areas for them to be able to run their affairs without dipping in their own pockets. I think that discussion will have to be had in the near future. But that is the normal political things. The purpose of my second company in the title was that as we are dealing with the past, remember we are only reacting. I think I've just mentioned we're just reacting, we are aping, isn't it? We are just trying to survive based on the experiences that we faced in the colonial phase. As we do that, the ground has been shifting. That's my last submission. The ground has shifted badly. The company is back. The company you have now is not physical, looking for physical territory. It's virtual. It is not looking for manual laborers again. It doesn't want to even come here, but it is controlling business here. It is wealthier than several African countries combined. Companies like Microsoft, Google, Facebook, that, WhatsApp, TikTok, have humongous resources that African governments can only dream of. Okay? And yet they're here, and they're also not here. Okay? They're taking charge of your spaces. And these are going to be your constitutional questions, my suspicion. After you've dealt with the ones I've mentioned, you will have to focus here in the near future. I'm thinking here about big data. I'm told in big data, we're not customers. Did you hear that? They don't want you to buy it. They don't want to buy you either, but they're using your data to do business with you. So you're a resource. And they've acquired you for free. Okay? Big companies like Google now know you more than your spouse. Sometimes you open your phone and it knows you're an Eldoret. Do you know why? Because you Googled where you want to sleep. So because they know you're an Eldoret, they're marketing everything Eldoret about you. Isn't it? Okay? These people know what you eat, they know what you drink, they know where you sleep, they know who you call, they know what you search, they know which music you listen to, and eventually they can predict you. But they can also guide you. They can also inform you. And soon they will take control of our minds. What we call conscience, that is protected in the Bill of Rights, is going to be somebody else's conscience. They will determine political outcomes. They have already, we know that. They can help you choose a particular political candidate or make you choose the other, just by the kind of information they throw your way in these gadgets. So our choice, our conscience is gone. Trust me, soon gone, already gone, if I'm not wrong. Privacy is gone. You no longer have privacy. In fact, it will be possible to record the birth of a child and record the death of the child on the internet. Hope you know that all these cameras are connected and they pick everything you do. So between the two certificates, the death and the birth certificate, the computer companies will have your data, including which car you drive, which street you walk, which school you go to, who you work with, how you work, whether you run or walk, whether they are going to have it, and not here in America, Silicon Valley, stuff like that. Did you know that? Google threatened to put the entire world on a map, all the streets and paths. They threatened that a few years ago. They have achieved it. Google has guided me recently to places I did think were on a map. Isn't it? Villages, Tarakaniti. Deep inside Tarakaniti. I was able to use Google to get somewhere. Okay? So they have all this kind of information about us. They are changing our cultures, our cultural values. They are changing our moral behavior, our moral patterns. Okay? Even more importantly, they're going to render us jobless. From my reading on this subject, manual laborers, people who do repetitive jobs, even if they use their brain, like teaching, if you just come and teach, we will not need to do it. A machine will come here and do it next time. So all of us will be asked to stay at home. We'll be paid salaries to stay at home and get fat. And the machines and the computers will do their job. Okay? Think about it. We can have a discussion at some free time. Think about it. By the way, I would not have been worried about this if all these companies were Kenyan or African. You know where they come from. They are all American, all Silicon Valley companies. There's a bit of Chinese here and there, but you know the kind of battles even TikTok is facing in America at the moment. They will not let those ones survive. The bulk of these companies are either Western in terms of Europe or American companies. So we are going to be dominated again more than ever before. My own suspicion is that this is a battle that will have to be fought, okay? It will have to be fought by your generation. And I don't know the outcome of this battle, but it's going to be a battle against companies that will be wealthier than the entire continent put together. That's a battle we must fight. So what have I said all through? I've said that they came, they conquered, okay? And all along we have been reacting. And in our reaction, we've had a long story, sometimes getting it right on a short-term basis, but it's just a reaction. Sometimes just doing what they are doing, and sometimes destroying even the little and surviving. And as we struggle, they have moved on. Okay? They have moved on. The battle is different. The battlefield is different. The terrain is different. The goal has shifted. And the Africans are still in Mandamano as we speak. As people move forward. So from company to company was my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.